The sky over Erebos 3 used to shine like polished glass. People once called it the jewel of the frontier, a place where humanity proved it could live among the stars. Families had built homes there, children ran through domed parks, and farmers grew green fields under the artificial sun. Life had become peaceful, too peaceful, some said. No one believed danger could reach them across such distance. But peace has a fragile heartbeat, and one quiet dawn it stopped. The first warning came as a strange vibration beneath the ground. It was so faint that most ignored it, thinking it was another mining tremor. But then the power grid flickered. Communication screens turned to static. The colony's sky shield dimmed, and for the first time in years, people saw the real stars without the blue shimmer of protection. Within minutes, everything that had seemed safe was ripped away. Commander Hale, who had served most of his life in rescue missions, stood at the edge of the control tower watching red lights bloom across the radar. He had seen disasters before, storms, quakes, crashes, but this was different. The signals were not natural. They were moving too fast, closing in from orbit. He gave the order to seal the upper docks, but half of the systems were already offline. He turned to the young technician beside him, whose face had gone pale. "Send a general alert," he said quietly. "Something's coming." Down in the medical district, Dr. Lin was finishing her night shift. The hospitals had been calm for weeks. Only routine checkups and minor injuries filled her hours. She was cleaning instruments when the ground shook so hard that the lights burst. Within seconds, the emergency alarms screamed through the corridors. She rushed outside and saw fire streaking across the sky, long trails of orange light falling through the atmosphere. For a moment, she thought it was a meteor shower. Then one of them hit a supply station beyond the valley, and the blast knocked her off her feet. The next few hours were a blur of confusion. Reports flooded in from every sector. The main satellite chain was gone, the orbital ring destroyed, and no signal could reach Earth. The colony's defense platforms had gone silent one after another. No one even knew what the enemy looked like. The attack came without warning or message. The people of Erebos 3, once proud explorers, suddenly found themselves refugees on their own planet. Commander Hale tried to organize a response. His voice over the loudspeakers was calm, though his hands shook behind the console. "All citizens proceed to the underground shelters. Do not panic. Stay together." But panic spread faster than the flames. Streets filled with families carrying whatever they could grab. Shuttles overloaded with passengers lifted off and vanished into the dark, hoping to escape into space. But many were caught in the crossfire. The colony's communication net broke down completely, leaving only short-range radio. Dr. Lin converted a storage hall into an emergency clinic. The wounded came in waves: burns, fractures, smoke inhalation. She worked without rest, moving from one patient to another. She could hear the distant thunder of impacts above like endless storms. Between treatments, she recorded quick notes into a handheld device describing what she saw. "If anyone finds this later," she whispered into the recorder, "they'll know what happened here." Her voice cracked, but she kept speaking. It was her way of fighting back against the silence closing in around them. By the second day, the colony's leadership council had vanished. No one knew if they were dead or hiding. Commander Hale took command of what little defense force remained. He gathered pilots, engineers, and even civilians who had once worked as miners or farmers. Together they repaired a few old aircraft, arming them with whatever they could find: salvaged cannons, mining lasers, chemical rockets. The people called themselves the Last Wall. It wasn't much, but it gave them purpose. Outside the shelters, the landscape looked nothing like the peaceful colony it once was. Towers leaned at strange angles, smoke poured from ruptured factories, and the artificial rivers glowed with light from broken reactors. The horizon, once filled with silver domes, now flickered red from fires that never seemed to end. Yet amid the destruction there was a strange unity. People who had never spoken to each other before now shared food, blankets, and stories. Fear made them human again. Each night, Commander Hale climbed to the roof of the command bunker and stared at the empty sky. He would tap the radio transmitter again and again, sending the same short message. "This is Erebos 3. We are under attack. Need immediate assistance." The signal vanished into static every time. No answer came. He sometimes imagined a faint voice replying, but it was always just the wind through the damaged antenna. Dr. Lin noticed that more people had started coming to her clinic not only for wounds, but for comfort. They asked the same question over and over, is Earth coming? She didn't know what to say. She wanted to promise yes, that the fleets were on their way, but she couldn't lie. Instead, she told them, Earth hears everything, even when we can't hear back. Some smiled through tears. Others just nodded silently and walked away. By the fourth day, food supplies began to run out. The hydroponic farms had been destroyed in the first bombardment, and the air recyclers were failing. The shelters were overcrowded. Diseases spread quickly. Commander Hale's soldiers shared their rations with the children, pretending they weren't hungry themselves. One evening, as he watched a little girl share her piece of bread with her brother, he realized how fragile hope had become, so small it could fit inside a child's hand. In the following week, the attack slowed. The unknown ship seemed to have withdrawn into orbit, perhaps waiting, perhaps studying. The silence felt heavier than the explosions before it. Some people believed the enemy was planning to return and finish them off. Others thought they were already gone and that the colony had simply been left to die. Dr. Lin used the quiet to restock the clinic from whatever storage she could find. She trained volunteers to help with basic care, teaching them how to clean wounds, mix simple medicine, and comfort the dying. Even if the world ends, she told them softly, we still choose how we treat each other. Commander Hale gathered his remaining team to discuss survival plans. There were fewer than 100 trained defenders left. He proposed to move deeper underground, into the old mining tunnels where the enemy sensors might not reach them. Some objected. It was dangerous, unstable, but there was no other option. They began moving civilians one group at a time, using dim lights and makeshift carts. In those dark tunnels, people whispered prayers, songs, and memories of sunlight. The air smelled of dust and metal, but it was the only safe place left. One night, as Dr. Lin walked through the tunnels checking on patients, she found Commander Hale sitting alone beside a broken generator. His uniform was torn, his face lined with exhaustion. She sat beside him in silence. After a while, he said, "Do you think they'll come?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said quietly, "I think humanity always comes. Maybe late, maybe bleeding, but it comes." He smiled weakly, the first real smile in days. Weeks passed in that dim half-life. The people of Erebos 3 grew thinner but harder. They learned to make light from battery scraps, food from dried roots, and courage from one another's company. Children drew stars on the tunnel walls with pieces of chalk, pretending it was the sky. Each drawing looked slightly different, some bright, some messy, but they all showed the same hope. A large ship descending through clouds, wings spread wide. Dr. Lin kept recording everything. She described the small acts that kept them alive, a mechanic fixing a water pipe with wire, an old teacher telling stories by flashlight, a group of mothers building toys from metal scraps to keep children quiet. These moments, she believed, were as important as any battle. If we disappear, she said into her recorder, someone must know that we tried. One morning, the outer sensors detected movement far above the planet. Commander Hale rushed to the control post, heart pounding. The readings were faint and erratic, but they didn't match the enemy's usual pattern. He tried sending a coded signal toward it, even though he knew their transmitter was barely functional. The answer came as a single pulse, then another, then 3 quick bursts. The pattern was human. For the first time in months, he felt his throat tighten. He didn't tell anyone right away. He wasn't sure if it was real or just interference. Still, he kept his eyes on the monitor, waiting. Down in the shelter, life went on as if nothing had changed. Dr. Lin treated a boy with a fever, then sat beside an old man who wanted someone to talk to before sleeping. The air smelled of smoke and damp stone, but there was a calmness in the people now. They had learned to live with uncertainty. She looked up toward the ceiling and imagined Earth somewhere beyond those stars. Perhaps unaware, perhaps preparing. In her heart, she whispered a single line. "Please don't forget us." That night, as the last lights dimmed in the tunnels, Commander Hale stood outside near the ruins of the old control tower. The sky was clouded with ash, yet somewhere above it he believed a signal was traveling through the dark. One final call for help. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind against his face. The colony was dying, but it was not defeated. There was still breath in their lungs, still strength in their hands, still a spark in the ashes. Erebos 3 waited in silence, a wounded world holding its breath. No one knew if rescue would come. But in the hearts of... The days after the first attacks passed slowly, like time itself had stopped moving. The people of Erebos 3 lived underground now, deep in the cold tunnels that once held mining machines. The air was thin and smelled of dust and oil. No one knew what day it was anymore. The sky above remained quiet, but that silence carried more fear than the sound of bombs ever did. Commander Hale walked the narrow corridors every morning, checking on the guards and the small camps the survivors had built. His uniform had lost its color. It was now just a layer of dust and sweat. He had stopped counting how many people were left, but he knew it wasn't many. Every night, a few didn't wake up. Some from illness, some from exhaustion, some simply because they'd lost hope. The radio remained silent. The colony's engineers tried to fix the transmitters, but without spare parts, it was useless. The connection to Earth was gone. The people were alone. Dr. Lin spent her days moving between the sick and the injured. She had stopped using medical records. There was no point. There were no medicines left. Only bandages made from torn fabric and painkillers that were counted like gold. Yet she refused to stop working. Each person she saved felt like a small victory against the universe itself. At night, when the tunnels grew dark and the sound of machines faded, she sat with the others around a weak heater made from scrap metal. They didn't talk much about the attacks anymore. Instead, they shared memories of the world before, the smell of rain on Earth, the taste of fresh fruit, the sound of ocean waves. Many of the children had never seen any of those things. To them, Earth was just a story their parents told to make them feel safe. Commander Hale joined them sometimes, though he rarely spoke. He kept listening to the faint static of his radio device, hoping for even a whisper of a signal. Every night he would adjust the frequency, send a short message, and wait. It had become a ritual, his way of keeping faith alive. "Maybe they can't hear us," Dr. Lin said one evening. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe they hear us but can't get here yet." No one said anything after that. The only sound was the soft crackling of the heater and the distant dripping of water from the tunnel walls. The colony's power supply was almost gone. The few working generators had to be turned off during the day to save fuel. Darkness became normal. The children no longer cried about it. They learned to live with shadows. Some drew pictures on the walls with pieces of chalk, bright suns, stars, and human ships with long wings. Every drawing carried a message. We are still here. As the days turned into weeks, a strange calm settled over the survivors. They were still afraid, but the fear had changed. It was no longer the loud kind that made people scream and run. It was quiet and deep, like an old wound that refused to heal. People stopped asking when rescue would come. Instead, they asked smaller questions: when they would eat again, when the next water run would happen, when the tunnels would be lit again. Hope had shrunk into small, practical things. Dr. Lin tried to keep spirits alive. She told stories to the children during the evenings, stories about the first explorers who left Earth to reach new worlds. She spoke about courage, about how humanity always found a way to survive even when everything seemed impossible. The children listened with wide eyes, and for a few moments they forgot the cold and hunger. Sometimes, when the nights grew too quiet, she would sit alone with her small recorder and speak into it softly. "This is day 34, she would say. "We are still alive. The people are holding on. I don't know if anyone will ever hear this, but maybe one day they will." Her voice trembled sometimes, but she never stopped recording. Commander Hale, meanwhile, began organizing small teams to search the surface again. They had to find food, parts, or even survivors trapped in other sectors. Each trip was dangerous. The enemy could still be watching from orbit, but staying underground forever would mean slow death. He chose volunteers who were willing to take the risk. One cold morning, he led a group to the surface. The landscape looked worse than before. The once green plains were now black and covered with ash. The cities were nothing more than metal bones. The sky hung heavy and gray, and the air burned in the throat. Yet here and there, signs of life appeared: a flag buried under debris, a photo lying in the dust, the remains of shelters where people had tried to survive. They found a few crates of food inside a collapsed warehouse and carried them back with trembling arms. When they returned, the cheers that greeted them echoed through the tunnels like music. It wasn't much, just a few boxes, but to the people of Erebos 3 it felt like a miracle. That night, they shared a real meal together for the first time in weeks. Someone even laughed, and for a moment it sounded like the world before everything fell apart. Dr. Lin noticed the change in people's eyes. They were still tired, still scared, but now there was a spark again. She smiled quietly as she watched a mother feed her child and whisper stories of Earth. Hope, she thought, wasn't something that arrived in a ship. It was something people built inside themselves, one small act at a time. But even small hope couldn't stop the sickness that had begun spreading. The lack of clean water and proper air made many fall ill. Dr. Lin worked without sleep, caring for the weak and comforting the dying. She had no cure for most of them, only her words. "You're not alone," she told each one. "We're still together." Sometimes she cried when no one was watching, then washed her face and went back to work. Commander Hale faced his own battles. Some people had started questioning his leadership. They were tired of waiting, tired of doing nothing but surviving. A small group argued that they should try to rebuild the old communication tower, even if it meant exposure to danger. Others said they should prepare to leave the planet completely, build whatever ships were left and take their chances in space. He listened to all of them, knowing they were speaking out of fear, not rebellion. "I understand," he said calmly, "but if we rush, we die. If we stay smart, we live." His steady tone quieted the crowd, but he could see in their faces that patience was running thin. That night, he went to the surface alone. He stood among the ruins, staring at the stars above. They looked so peaceful, shining as if nothing had changed. He wondered if anyone on Earth was looking back toward this planet, thinking of them. Maybe some radio operator was still trying to reach them, not knowing their signals couldn't pass through the debris field. Or maybe he thought Earth had simply given up. The thought hit him hard, but he pushed it away. Down below, Dr. Lin found one of the children sitting alone, drawing circles in the dirt. "What are you making?" she asked. "A window," the child said, "so we can see the ships when they come." Dr. Lin smiled gently. "That's a good idea," she said. Then she sat beside the child, helping to draw stars around the circle. "Maybe one day we'll see them for real." Weeks turned into months. The people of Erebos 3 had become quiet survivors of a forgotten war. They had no way of knowing what was happening beyond their world. Some believed Earth had fallen too. Others still whispered that rescue was coming. No one could prove either side right or wrong. Commander Hale kept leading one day at a time. He trained the younger survivors to guard the tunnels, to use scanners to repair what little machinery remained. He refused to let despair take control. "As long as we're breathing," he told them, "we're not finished." Dr. Lin continued her recordings, her voice softer now, but still steady. "We've learned to live without sunlight. We've learned to make peace with silence. But sometimes when the children laugh, it feels like the world is still turning. In truth, everyone was waiting for something, anything, to change. Every time the ground trembled, they thought it was another attack. Every time a spark of light appeared in the sky, they rushed to the surface, hoping to see human ships. And every time it turned out to be nothing, they went back below, hearts a little heavier. But even in that endless waiting, they built something stronger than fear. They built community. They learned to share, to protect one another, to live with less but give more. They had become a small version of humanity itself, broken, tired but still alive. One evening, as the tunnels grew silent again, Commander Hale turned off his radio after another failed attempt to contact Earth. He stared at the small blinking light that meant nothing, and whispered, "If anyone's out there, don't forget us." He didn't know if his words went anywhere, but somewhere in the darkness of space, a faint signal pulsed outward, crossing the cold void, still carrying a single truth, that humanity was still fighting to be heard. And beneath the dead sky of Erebos 3, the survivors waited. They didn't know that far beyond their reach, Earth had already heard. The morning started like any other. The tunnels were quiet except for the soft sound of dripping water. People woke slowly, moving carefully through the dark corridors. There was no clock, no sunrise, only the faint glow of the lamps powered by whatever batteries they still had left. Every day felt the same. Every day was survival. Dr. Lin moved through the shelter, checking on patients. The air was cold, and her breath made small clouds as she spoke to them softly. Most of the sick were sleeping. A few whispered to her, asking if there was any news from the surface. She always gave the same gentle answer, "Not yet, but maybe soon." She didn't know if she believed it herself anymore, but those words seemed to help. Commander Hale had been awake all night again. The radio was still useless, the signals weak and broken. He sat staring at the flickering screen, listening to the endless hiss of static. Every so often he thought he heard something, an echo, a faint hum, but it always disappeared. Still, he couldn't stop listening. It had become more than duty. It was the only connection he had left to the world beyond this broken planet. By midday, the power ran out in 2 of the main tunnels. The lights faded and darkness swallowed everything. A few children began to cry and their mothers comforted them with soft voices. Commander Hale ordered his team to move the remaining lights toward the medical area. "We can't see everywhere," he said, "but we'll make sure the weak aren't left in the dark." That night, no one could sleep. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. The ground shook twice, softly but enough to make the walls groan. The people thought it was another bombardment starting, but nothing followed. The silence after the tremor was worse than the shaking itself. Dr. Lin sat near the entrance tunnel, writing on her recorder again. Her voice was tired but steady. "Day 81, she said quietly. "We've lost count of the days, really. Some think it's been 3 months since the last message. The skies are quiet, but quiet doesn't always mean safety. We keep waiting." She stopped recording when she heard footsteps. Commander Hale appeared, holding a lantern. "You should rest," he said, though his own eyes looked just as exhausted. "So should you," she replied with a small smile. "But I suppose neither of us will." He looked up toward the surface tunnel. "Something feels different tonight," he said. "Good or bad?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he answered softly. The next morning, the air outside the tunnel seemed strangely bright. When Hale's scouts went up to the surface, they noticed something odd. The dust in the air shimmered faintly, as if reflecting distant light. For a moment, they thought it was the sun breaking through the clouds, but the color wasn't right. It was pale blue, flickering like a pulse. They called for Hale immediately. He climbed to the surface, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The sky above was still covered with thick gray clouds, but something behind them was glowing. He lifted his binoculars and scanned the horizon. At first, he saw nothing but the usual wreckage, the ruins, the smoke, the long-dead cities. But then, beyond the far mountains, a sharp flash split the clouds. It wasn't lightning. It was deliberate. A beam of light pierced through the haze, followed by another and another. The flashes repeated, rhythmic and precise. Hale's heart began to pound. He recognized the pattern. It was a coded transmission, an old distress acknowledgement signal used by Earth's Navy. He could barely breathe. "They found us," he whispered. He rushed back down the tunnels, shouting for Dr. Lin. The survivors stared at him in confusion as he called for attention. "There's something happening in the sky," he said breathlessly. "I think it's them. I think they're here." People didn't react right away. Some blinked, unsure if they heard him correctly. Others started crying quietly, afraid to believe. They had been disappointed too many times before. Dr. Lin put a hand on his arm. "Are you sure?" she asked. He nodded firmly. "I'm sure." They climbed to the surface together. More people followed, curious and trembling. When they stepped out into the open, the light was clearer now. The clouds rippled like waves as something massive moved above them. A distant sound rolled through the air, deep and heavy like thunder that didn't end. The ground shook gently beneath their feet. Then they saw it. A shape broke through the sky, dark and enormous, surrounded by fire and mist. It wasn't one of the enemy ships. It was human. Its hull carried the markings of Earth's fleet, though half covered in scorch marks from battle. Its engines burned like a second sunrise. Smaller vessels followed it, cutting through the clouds in formation. For a moment, no one moved. The entire crowd stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths open. It didn't feel real. Some people fell to their knees. Others laughed through tears. The sky, once a symbol of fear, now looked alive again. Dr. Lin's eyes filled with tears she hadn't let fall in months. "They came," she whispered. They really came. The great ship began firing into the upper atmosphere. The bright flashes of its cannons turned the clouds gold. The alien vessels that had been waiting in orbit tried to respond, but they were caught off guard. Streaks of light cut across the sky, followed by explosions that echoed for miles. The survivors on the ground could only watch, their faces glowing in the light of the battle above. Commander Hale grabbed the radio transmitter, even though it was broken. He shouted into it anyway. "This is Erevos 3. We are alive! Repeat, we are alive." He didn't know if anyone could hear him, but he kept repeating it. The static burst suddenly, And then faintly a voice replied, "This is Fleet Command. We hear you, Erebos 3. Hold your position. You're not alone anymore." The words hit him like lightning. He dropped the transmitter, unable to speak for a moment. Dr. Lin placed her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. The crowd began to cheer, though many could barely find the strength. Some just held each other and cried. Above, the sky was now full of movement. Dozens of smaller human ships streaked through the air, chasing enemy vessels that tried to flee. The clouds glowed orange from the energy blasts. It looked like the heavens themselves were burning. Yet for the people of Erebos 3, it wasn't destruction they saw, it was salvation. Dr. Lin watched as the light reflected in the eyes of the children beside her. They were smiling for the first time since she could remember. She realized then that hope was not just a word, it was a sight, a sound, a heartbeat that could return when least expected. The battle continued for hours. Commander Hale ordered his team to prepare landing beacons using whatever equipment still worked. "If they're coming for us, we'll guide them in," he said. Men and women scrambled to the surface, lighting flares and assembling makeshift markers across the ruins. The sky roared above them, and each explosion felt like another chain breaking. By evening, the largest ship, its name barely visible through the smoke, Sol Invictus, descended lower. Massive thrusters sent waves of dust rolling across the plains. The noise was overwhelming, but no one cared. The people ran toward the light, waving their arms, shouting words that couldn't be heard over the thunder but carried in their faces. Dr. Lin fell to her knees, watching as smaller rescue shuttles broke off from the ship and descended toward the colony. She could see human insignias painted on their sides, symbols she had thought she'd never see again. The sight felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. When the first shuttle touched down, its doors opened slowly, and soldiers in worn armor stepped out. Their uniforms were dirty, their faces lined with exhaustion, but they were unmistakably human. One of them looked around at the crowd and raised his hand in salute. "We got your signal," he said through a loudspeaker. "We're here to take you home." The crowd erupted into cries and cheers. Some laughed, some sobbed uncontrollably. Commander Hale stood still for a moment, trying to take it all in. He could hardly believe it was real. For months he had stared at an empty sky, believing no one was coming, and now humanity had filled that same sky with light. Dr. Lin walked forward and reached out to touch the shuttle's metal side. It was warm from re-entry, smooth under her fingers. She looked up at the soldier who had spoken. "You have no idea," she said softly, "how long we've waited to hear your voice." The soldier's eyes softened behind his visor. "We heard your last message," he said. "It took time to reach you, but we don't leave our own behind." As night fell, the survivors gathered around fires again, but this time the flames were reflections of victory, not destruction. The stars above seemed brighter than ever, as if the universe itself had opened its eyes to witness what humanity could do when it refused to give up. Dr. Lin sat beside the children, watching the lights of the ships moving overhead. "Remember this," she told them quietly. "There will be dark days again, but light always finds its way back." Commander Hale stood a few steps away, looking toward the horizon where the last enemy ships were disappearing in flames. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. The air still carried smoke and dust, but underneath it, he could smell something else. Hope. And as the people of Erebos 3 looked up at the sky that had once brought them fear, they realized it now carried a different promise. Humanity had come. They were not forgotten. When the world had seemed lost, humanity arrived, and with them came the dawn. The sky above the shattered colony was a strange color that day, half ash gray, half burning red. People on the ground had stopped running. After months of fear and silence, something new filled the air. Hope, mixed with disbelief. The humans who had survived the invasion stood outside the ruins of their shelters, looking up at the glowing clouds. They had seen the streaks of light tearing across the horizon, flashes that weren't alien missiles this time. It was the human fleet, arriving at last. Commander Hale stood on the command balcony of the underground outpost, his uniform torn and covered in dust. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from the shock of seeing those bright trails. For so long he had believed Earth had given up on them, but now, those same skies that once brought terror were shining with the fire of returning ships. Through the static-filled speakers, a voice came through, calm, confident, familiar. "This is Admiral Reyes of the Earth Defense Fleet. All surviving colonies, stand by. Humanity has arrived. No one could move for a few moments. The words didn't seem real. Dr. Lin was standing beside a group of injured civilians when she heard the message. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in months she smiled. Around her, people hugged each other, laughed, cried, and shouted into the air. The feeling of being forgotten vanished in an instant. The sound of human engines thundered through the sky, a sound they thought they would never hear again. Moments later, the first wave of Earth's ships began targeting the enemy fleet. The alien crafts, large and dark like shards of glass, tried to regroup, but the human dreadnought Sol Invictus was already in position. Its cannons glowed white-hot as beams of light cut through the void, turning the darkness into a sea of burning wreckage. The shockwaves shook the planet's surface and dust clouds rose over the colony. Commander Hale gave quick orders to his small remaining defense unit. "Get all civilians underground. Shield the wounded. We're not out of this yet." The battle above was fierce. Alien ships poured out waves of plasma fire, hitting the upper atmosphere. But the human fleet responded with perfect coordination. Fighters darted between explosions, defending transports that carried supplies and medics for the survivors below. Hale watched from a nearby ridge as the sky lit up like a storm. It wasn't just a fight, it was a statement. Humanity had returned not with words but with strength and purpose. Dr. Lin rushed back into the makeshift medical station. The wounded were still coming in from the outer zones where alien drones had attacked. Even in chaos, she worked steadily, bandaging wounds, giving water, whispering comfort. Every few minutes, the ground shook from distant impacts and dust fell from the ceiling, but she didn't stop. "It's our chaos now," she whispered to herself. "And that makes all the difference." For the first time since the invasion began, she could feel something beyond fear. It was unity. Engineers worked beside farmers to fix power lines. Children helped carry supplies. Old soldiers came out of retirement to guide the young fighters. The people who had once been scattered were now one again, bound by the same thought: Earth hadn't abandoned them. Meanwhile, in the upper atmosphere, the human fleet executed a complex counterattack. Admiral Reyes had studied every recorded battle transmission from the colony, learning the enemy's formation patterns. The alien ships had no emotion, no compassion, just mechanical precision. But humanity had something stronger: creativity and defiance. They adapted mid-battle, changing formation in seconds, doing things no machine could predict. One of the smaller destroyers, the Aegis Dawn, took heavy damage but refused to fall back. Its crew broadcasted a message to the entire system before going silent: for Erebos, for every colony that never stopped believing. Their sacrifice tore a hole in the alien formation, and the main dreadnought fired through it, destroying the enemy command ship in a burst of light visible from the planet's surface. People on the ground cheered as the night sky turned into a spectacle of fire. Commander Hale coordinated with orbiting drones to guide human dropships into the safe zones. Dozens of armored carriers descended from the sky, releasing relief units and ground troops to secure key areas. When the first ship landed near the Capitol dome, people ran to it, waving makeshift flags and banners they had kept hidden through the occupation. Soldiers stepped out in silver-gray armor, saluting the survivors. For many of them, it was like watching angels descend from the heavens. But the fight was not over. The aliens began launching ground assaults in desperation. Black metallic creatures stormed through the outer ruins, attacking anything that moved. Hale and his small team joined forces with the new soldiers from Earth to hold the perimeter. The air was filled with noise, distant gunfire, roaring engines, and the pulse of shields. Hale led from the front, not as a commander but as one of them, shouting directions and pulling people to safety. "We hold here," he yelled. "For every person they took, for every life they tried to erase." Dr. Lin, from her station, watched the distant flashes of battle through the cracked window. She knew that every light out there was someone fighting for the same cause: survival, home, and humanity. She recorded her thoughts on an old data pad, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I can hear them fighting. The ground shakes, but it feels alive again. For so long, this planet was silent, and now it roars with life. Even if this is the last day, we'll remember that we fought as one." The human fleet kept pressing forward, ship by ship. The enemy lines began to break apart, scattering across the system. Communications between the colonies reconnected for the first time in months. On the command screens, flickering images of other surviving stations appeared. Cheering faces, flags raised, people shouting in disbelief as they realized they were not alone. Across light years, humanity was rising together. When dawn broke on Erebos 3, the smoke finally began to fade. The sun shone over a battered land, but it was still their land. The alien ships that once filled the sky were now falling debris, glowing like tiny meteors. Commander Hale climbed onto a ridge and looked at the horizon where the human ships hovered like guardians. Behind him, people were rebuilding, clearing debris, and setting up communications. He took a deep breath and whispered, "We made it." Dr. Lin stepped outside the medical shelter, her uniform covered in dust and blood. She looked up and saw a group of children pointing at the sky where a human flag shimmered from one of the landing ships. The sight brought tears to her eyes. She took her recorder and said softly, "It's over for now. But what comes next will define us. Not just the victory, but how we rebuild, how we remember." That night, the survivors gathered in the ruins of the old plaza. A few portable lights flickered as people shared what little food they had left. Soldiers sat with civilians, engineers with farmers, pilots with medics. No ranks, no titles, just people. The stars above were quiet again, but now they held new meaning. They were no longer symbols of emptiness, but of connection. Somewhere in orbit, Admiral Reyes gave a final transmission to the colony. "Erebos 3, you stood when the universe expected you to fall. Humanity has seen your strength and will never forget it. This isn't the end, it's the beginning of a new dawn." Down below, the people cheered. Commander Hale closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. He knew the battle was not completely over, but something had changed forever. Humanity had faced the darkest moment of its history, and instead of breaking, it had united. As the night grew quiet, Dr. Lin sat by the fire, writing her final note of the day. "When the skies burned," she wrote, "it wasn't destruction we saw, it was the light of our return. We fought not because we wanted war, but because we refused to disappear. That's what it means to be human." And in that moment, surrounded by tired but unbroken people, she realized something simple yet powerful. Hope wasn't something you waited for. Hope was something you built, one act of courage at a time. The morning began with an uneasy silence. The smoke from the night's battle still hung over the colony, turning the sunlight into a pale orange glow. The survivors had barely slept. Every sound, every vibration in the ground made them fear that the enemy would strike again. Commander Hale stood on what used to be the colony's main observation deck. It was half destroyed now, but it gave him a clear view of the horizon. He could see the remains of enemy ships scattered across the plains, burning faintly in the distance. But he also saw something else, human flags rising again, carried by groups of exhausted soldiers and civilians who refused to give up. For the first time since the invasion began, people could breathe without the weight of despair pressing down on them. Yet Hale knew the war wasn't over. The alien fleet was regrouping beyond the planet's orbit, preparing for one final strike. Earth's first wave of ships had done its job, but the Admiral's message was clear. If the aliens broke through this time, there would be no second chance. The fate of Erebos 3, and possibly every human colony, depended on what happened next. Dr. Lin moved through the crowded medical shelter, checking on patients and rationing supplies. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. The wounded were everywhere, soldiers, engineers, even children. She had seen fear before, but now she saw something stronger behind their eyes. They wanted to live, to rebuild, to protect what was left of their home. When she stepped outside for a moment of quiet, she saw people working together to repair broken drones and damaged shelters. It was chaotic, loud, and messy, but it was life returning. Suddenly the air vibrated with a deep hum. Everyone looked up. High above, the alien fleet appeared again, blotting out the sun like a dark curtain. Their ships were larger this time, moving in tight formation. The ground trembled as they began their descent. Hale immediately activated the emergency beacon. "All units, this is Commander Hale. The enemy is making their final push. Get to your positions. We hold them here." His voice was calm, even though his heart was pounding. The defense lines came alive. Civilians grabbed tools and joined soldiers to set up barriers. Drones rose into the sky, scanning for movement. Communication with the orbiting human fleet flickered with interference, but one message broke through. Admiral Reyes' voice. "Hold your ground. Reinforcements are on their way. You're not alone." Dr. Lin ran back to her station, helping move the injured deeper underground. She looked out the window one last time and saw the first streaks of plasma fire cut through the sky. The battle had begun. The alien ships unleashed a rain of energy bolts, striking the outskirts of the colony. The ground exploded in waves, throwing dust and debris everywhere. The roar of engines and the screams of the wounded filled the air, but still no one ran. Everyone stayed, doing their part. Hale's command post shook as a nearby building collapsed, but he didn't flinch. "Focus on the central ridge," he shouted. "If they break through there, we lose everything." His team of tired but determined fighters returned fire with the few remaining artillery pieces. Each shot counted. They didn't have advanced technology or endless ammunition like the invaders, but they had something the enemy couldn't understand: willpower. The enemy began to push harder, sending their mechanical ground units toward the colony. Strange metallic creatures marched through the ash, glowing with red light. The soldiers held their line, firing until their rifles overheated. Then something unexpected happened. Above them, the sky tore open with light once more. The second human fleet had arrived. Dozens of ships emerged from hyperspace, forming a protective wall between the planet and the incoming alien force. Cheers erupted across the colony. For a brief moment, everyone forgot their fear. The night sky filled with color, red, gold, and white beams crossing in every direction. The sound of explosions echoed through the mountains. It was chaos, but it was beautiful chaos, the kind that reminded everyone what humanity was fighting for. Dr. Lin could barely keep up with the rush of new patients. Dust covered her face and her arms ached, but she refused to stop. Every person she saved felt like one more reason to keep going. "You'll make it," she whispered to a young engineer whose arm was badly burned. "We all will." Her words weren't just for him. They were for herself, too. Up above, the Admiral's voice rang through the comms. "All units target their command ship. End this now." The human dreadnoughts shifted formation, focusing fire on the massive alien vessel that hovered above the atmosphere. Hale looked up, his chest tight. He knew that if they destroyed that ship, the rest of the fleet would fall apart. "Do it," he whispered. "End it." The next few minutes felt like hours. The alien ship's shields glowed brighter, holding back the attacks. Then from the colony itself, Hale's remaining artillery launched a final barrage. The shells streaked upward, cutting through the smoke. They hit the alien ship's weakened shields at the exact moment the human fleet unleashed its full firepower. A flash brighter than the sun filled the sky, followed by silence. When the light faded, the alien command ship was gone. Debris scattered like falling stars. One by one, the remaining enemy vessels lost coordination, drifting aimlessly before being destroyed by the human fleet. The people on the ground watched in disbelief as the sky cleared. Then came the sound they had been waiting for. Cheers, laughter, and the cries of relief that echoed across the colony. Dr. Lin stepped outside, wiping sweat and dust from her face. She looked around at the tired, wounded, and hopeful faces surrounding her. Some were crying, others were hugging, and many just stood still, staring at the horizon where the human ships glowed like small suns. "It's over," someone whispered. But Lin shook her head gently. "No," she said softly. "It's just beginning." Commander Hale walked through the crowd, his uniform torn and face smeared with dirt. People reached out to shake his hand, to thank him, but he only nodded humbly. "We did this together," he said quietly. "Every one of you." When he looked up at the sky, he saw the Admiral's final message flashing on a nearby screen. "Victory confirmed. Erebos 3 is free." All around the colony, survivors gathered. Engineers began fixing power lines. Farmers who had lost their fields started planning how to grow food again. The soldiers, still weary from battle, helped rebuild shelters instead of resting. Humanity's greatest victory wasn't in how they destroyed the enemy. It was in how they refused to stay broken. As night fell, the horizon glowed with soft light from the fires that were finally going out. People sat together under the open sky, sharing small meals and quiet stories. Some talked about their families back on Earth, others about the friends they had lost. There were tears, but also laughter. It wasn't the laughter of forgetting. It was the laughter of surviving. Dr. Lin recorded one final note for the day. Her voice was tired but calm. "The war is over," she said. "We are scarred, but we're still here. They tried to erase us, but they failed. We've learned that survival is not about strength alone. It's about unity. about standing together when everything falls apart. Commander Hale stood alone on a high ridge as the stars came out. The same stars that once felt cold and distant now looked warm and alive. The sound of rebuilding echoed in the distance, mixing with the gentle hum of the fleet in orbit. For a long moment he just watched in silence, knowing what they had accomplished wasn't just a victory for Erebos 3. It was a message to the universe. When all seemed lost, humanity didn't vanish. It arrived. It fought back. It remembered who it was, and in doing so it changed the course of history forever. The war was finally over. The alien ships that once filled the sky were gone, leaving behind silence and smoke that slowly drifted away. For the first time in months, the colony on Erebos 3 could hear the sound of the wind again, soft, gentle, and almost strange after so many days of chaos. The people were tired, their bodies bruised, and their hearts heavy, but they were alive. The planet that once looked like a graveyard was now filled with movement again. Commander Hale stood at the edge of what used to be the main plaza. The buildings around him were half destroyed, the streets cracked and blackened, but he didn't see ruins anymore. He saw people rebuilding. Everywhere he looked, someone was doing something to help. Children carried water containers. Old engineers repaired broken power grids. Soldiers who had fought in the final battle now lifted debris and cleared roads. The war had taken so much, but it hadn't taken their spirit. Dr. Lin walked through the plaza, holding her small recorder. She had been documenting everything since the beginning, and now she wanted to record what came after. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She stopped near the old fountain, now filled with dust instead of water, and pressed record. "Day 1 of peace," she said softly. "We are still standing." The human fleet remained in orbit, watching over the colony like silent guardians. Some of the soldiers were already heading back to Earth, but most stayed behind to help rebuild. Supply ships arrived one after another, bringing food, medicine, and construction materials. When one of the landing ships touched down, people clapped and cheered as crates were unloaded. The colony's children ran toward the ship, waving small flags someone had made from scraps of fabric. Commander Hale spent his days working alongside the others. He refused any special treatment, even though everyone called him a hero. When people thanked him, he simply said, "We survived because we didn't give up." That became something of a motto for the colony. Those words were painted on a large wall near the central dome, simple and powerful, reminding everyone what they had gone through. The first few weeks were the hardest. The planet's air was still thick with dust and power systems kept failing. Every night people gathered around fires for warmth and light. They shared stories, some about what they had lost and others about what they hoped to build again. It was during one of those nights that Dr. Lin noticed something special. People weren't talking about fear anymore. They were talking about the future. They discussed how to grow crops again, how to restore clean water, and how to reopen schools. A young boy walked up to her one evening, holding a small metal star he had found in the rubble. "Was this from the war?" he asked. She smiled gently and said, "Maybe. But now it's a reminder that we can shine again." The boy nodded and ran off to show it to his friends. It was a small moment, but it made her realize something. The war had united them in a way nothing else could. Commander Hale and a team of volunteers started a reconstruction program. They called it the Renewal. It wasn't just about rebuilding walls, it was about rebuilding hope. Every sunrise marked new progress. Homes were repaired. Communication towers were reconnected. For the first time since the invasion, the colony sent a clear signal back to Earth. The message was short but powerful. Erebos 3 stands. When Earth received the message, it was broadcast across every channel. People cried, cheered, and celebrated the colony that had once been thought lost. Supplies poured in from every corner of human space. The survivors of Erebos 3 were no longer victims. They were symbols of endurance. News anchors called them the heart of humanity. Dr. Lin's medical camp slowly transformed into a permanent hospital. She trained new medics, some of them young volunteers who had lost everything in the war. They worked long hours patching wounds and comforting families. Yet even in exhaustion, there was joy. One morning, as she walked through the hospital courtyard, she saw a group of children playing in the sunlight. Their laughter filled the air, echoing through the once silent streets. For her, that sound meant more than any victory. Up in orbit, Admiral Reyes recorded a final message to the colony before departing. His voice, strong and proud, echoed through the comm systems. Erebos 3 showed the galaxy what it means to be human. You faced extinction and answered with courage. Remember this, not as a story of war, but as a story of unity. When the message ended, everyone in the colony stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the transmitters fading away. Weeks turned into months. The scars of battle began to fade, though some would never truly disappear. The fields outside the colony slowly turned green again. Seeds were planted, water lines repaired, and small farms started to grow. Every time a new patch of grass appeared, people would stop to look, amazed that life could return to such a broken world. Commander Hale often spent his evenings walking along the ridge overlooking the valley. He rarely spoke about the war. When someone asked him how he managed to keep hope alive during the darkest days, he simply said, "Because I looked around and saw people still trying." He knew that courage wasn't found in grand speeches. It was in the small acts of kindness, the moments when someone chose to help instead of giving up. Dr. Lin finished compiling her recordings into what became known as the Erebos archives. It wasn't just a report. It was a record of humanity, of fear, loss, courage, and unity. She included messages from children, notes from engineers, and even a few words from soldiers who never made it home. When she submitted it to the Earth Historical Council, she wrote at the end, "We did not win because we were strong. We won because we remembered who we were." Years later, Erebos 3 became more than just a colony. It turned into a symbol, a living reminder of how humans could endure even in the darkest corners of the universe. New settlers arrived, drawn by the stories of bravery and unity. The central dome, once a site of destruction, became a monument filled with names of those who had fought and those who had rebuilt. In the evenings, lights from the dome could be seen from miles away, glowing softly like a star reborn. Commander Hale eventually stepped down from his command role, choosing a quiet life working with the new generation of colonists. Sometimes he would visit the monument and watch people leave flowers at its base. One day, as he stood there, a young woman approached him and said, "My parents survived because of your leadership." He shook his head and replied gently, "No, they survived because they believed." She smiled and he walked away, the wind carrying his words like a whisper. Dr. Lin continued her work as a teacher and historian. Her lectures were filled with real stories of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. She never exaggerated the battles or glorified the pain. Instead, she spoke about resilience, about how even in hopeless times humanity could still choose compassion. That, she would tell her students, is what saves us. Every year, on the anniversary of the final battle, the people of Erebos 3 gathered at the plaza. They lit candles and shared food not to mourn, but to celebrate. Children recited lines from Dr. Lin's archives, and songs were sung under the starlit sky. The event became known as the Day of Light, and as the candles flickered in the night, the same stars that once witnessed their suffering now witnessed their rebirth. One evening, long after the celebration had ended, Dr. Lin sat by the edge of the plaza watching the stars. Her recorder was still with her, worn and scratched, but working. She pressed record one last time. "This is my final entry," she said softly. "The colony has healed. The people have rebuilt. The sky is clear again. We once thought we were alone, forgotten by the universe. But when all seemed lost, humanity arrived, not just in ships but in hearts. And that's how we turned the darkness into light." Her voice faded into the quiet wind. The recorder clicked off. In the distance, children laughed. Lights glowed from newly built homes, and the world moved forward. The planet that had once known only fear now stood as proof of what people could do when they stood together. And so, Erebos 3 became more than just a story in history books. It became a reminder. A reminder that no matter how far humanity travels or how dark the night becomes, there will always be those who light a flame and keep it burning, because in the end, that is what it means to be human.